The following program is brought to you by Stetson University College of Law, the National Clearinghouse for Science, Technology, and the Law, and was funded by the U.S. Department of Justice's Bureau of Justice Assistance's Capital Case Litigation Initiative.
Welcome to Forensic Science Essentials, Challenges in Fire Analysis and Document Examination, the fifth in our series of webinars for the Bureau of Justice Assistance. I'm your guest host, Eileen Finan, and I am the Director of Technology and Distance Education for the National Clearinghouse for Science, Technology, and the Law. This webinar is produced by the National Clearinghouse and the Office of Professional Education at Stetson University College of Law. Today's webinar will explore the investigative challenges and legal implications related to scientific fire analysis and forensic document examination. Our experts will discuss investigative techniques, current research, training, and standards for each discipline. The webinar will also address the credentials defense attorneys and prosecutors should look for when dealing with an expert witness in these disciplines. Our panelists will offer tips and takeaway points for effective presentation of scientific evidence and useful cross and direct examination strategies. Joining me today on the panel are Dr. Linton Mohammed and Mr. John Lentini. Dr. Linton Mohammed has been in the field of forensic document examination for over 30 years. He's testified as an expert witness more than 100 times in the United States, England, and the Caribbean. He's a co-author of The Neuroscience of Handwriting, Applications for Forensic Document Examination, and has published several papers in peer-reviewed journals. He is certified by the American Board of Document Examiners, Inc., and holds a diploma in document examination from the Chartered Society of Forensic Sciences. He is a member and past president of the American Society of Question Document Examiners, Inc., and is currently serving as the chair of Question Document Section of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. He serves on the editorial review boards of the Journal of Forensic Sciences and the Journal of the American Society of Question Documents, and is a guest reviewer for several other journals. Dr. Mohammed is an appointed member of the Expert Working Group in Human Factors in Forensic Document Examination, sponsored by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. He also has served 2 years as an appointed member of Physics and Pattern Evidence Scientific Area Committee of the Organization of Scientific Area Committees, OSAC, sponsored by NIST. And Mr. John Lentini is one of a handful of people certified to conduct both fire crime scene investigations and fire debris analysis. He has personally conducted more than 2,000 fire scene inspections and has appeared as an expert witness on more than 200 occasions. He is an active proponent of the standards for fire and other forensic investigations. He's a member of NFPA Technical Committee on Fire Investigations, 921, and Technical Committee on Fire Investigator Professional Qualifications, 1033. And he has served 3 times as the chair of ASTM Committee E30 on Forensic Science. John is the past he's the past chairman of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, Criminalistic Section. He also serves on NIST OSAC Subcommittee on Fire and Explosion Investigations. He received the Society of Fire Protection Engineers 2015 Person of the Year Award in recognition of his work in moving the fire investigation profession forward and in helping to prevent or reverse miscarriages of justice in arson cases. He is the author of Scientific Protocols for Fire Investigation, now in its 2nd edition, published by CRC Press. We'll now talk about some general information for the webinar prior to starting the content. While the webinar is in progress, you can chat with us at any time. Use the chat feature found on the right-hand side of your login screen. We will answer as many of your questions as possible. Please note that we may not be able to get to all of your questions while on the air. However, we will answer all the questions that you send us and send out a separate QA document via email. This webinar is designed for both prosecutors and defense attorneys. Attendees who complete the webinar will be eligible for continuing legal education credits. The Stetson Office of Professional Education will work with each individual participant for reporting specifics. CLC applications will be made to Florida and other states per individual request. Please email ope@law.stetson.edu for further information and state-specific requests. I'd like to start off the webinar by showing a video of fire flashover.
This chair is stuffed with plastic foam. It has the fuel potential of 50,000 candles and no mechanism to control the release. The steady heat of a cigarette accidentally dropped between the cushions can create a disaster. Initially, the burning cigarette creates a smoldering fire, which breaks down the foam stuffing into vaporous fuel. When there's enough heat and oxygen, it starts to flame. More heat produces more fuel, and the fire accelerates rapidly. Smoke and other products of the fire, including unburnt fuel, collect beneath the ceiling. Within 3 minutes, the temperature at the ceiling reaches 1,000 degrees, heating the contents of the entire room near the point of ignition. The carpet and other furnishings start to break down into vaporous fuels. Then, within seconds, in a process called flashover, everything in the room erupts into flame. No life survives flashover. After all the oxygen in the room is consumed, a pulsing backdraft sucks in air from the outside, depletes it in a surge of burning, then breathes in more. All this took place in less than 4 minutes and started with a smoldering cigarette.
This is a very dramatic video that illustrates not only the intensity and destructive nature of fire, but it also brings into perspective the challenges forensic disciplines face in gathering evidence and presenting that evidence within the nature and scope of investigations. They're largely complex in nature and have a broad range of investigative techniques associated with them. This webinar will focus on challenges associated with scientific fire analysis and document examination. John, I'd like to begin our program with an overview of fire analysis and what qualifies one to be considered a fire expert.
Well, as you saw in that video, it's very complicated what's going on. Michael Faraday, in the 19th century, one of the greatest scientists of that era, spent 2 very long lectures describing a candle flame. And what goes on in a candle flame is very complicated, but what happens in a structure fire is orders of magnitude more complicated. And as a result, people get it wrong sometimes when they go to a fire scene to determine the origin and cause. So what we're going to cover today is the different types of inaccuracies that people are likely to encounter as lawyers defending cases involving fire. What your cases might involve, fire set to cover a murder. These tend to be pretty obvious when we get the body and say that there's no smoke. The hard ones are the fires that are resulting in death, but the cause of the fire is going to determine the manner of death. The cause of death may be smoke inhalation. The manner of death is going to depend on a fire investigator determining what caused the fire. If it's an arson fire, then the manner of death is going to be homicide. If it's an accidental fire, it'll be an accident. And the medical examiner, with all of his years of education and training, is relying on a fire investigator who may not have anywhere near that amount of education and training. And it's all over the board. You have some people that are very qualified, and we have some people that are not. There are 4 kinds of fires that might be determined. One is natural, lightning, fire caused by a flooded basement, accidental, cooking fires, heating fires, intentional. And those are ones that involve a human setting the fire, putting it where it doesn't belong. And finally, undetermined. Now, all fires are undetermined when they start out. And ideally, if you do enough work, you can find the cause of the fire, but it is not very easy. Now, the fire experts you might encounter in a arson case fall into 3 categories. You'll have a chemist. They have a bachelor's degree. They may or may not be certified to do their work. You may have engineers. This requires a minimum of a bachelor's degree plus a PE plus a license. And then you have your fire investigators. High school diploma is currently the minimum requirement for education. A fire investigator may or may not be certified, and in most states they are required to have a private investigator license. But the licenses are all over the place. Chemists are generally not required to be licensed. Texas will be the first state requiring all forensic scientists to be licensed in 2019. The Texas Forensic Science Commission is putting that together. Engineers, they have to be licensed if they call themselves an engineer. The license exam actually requires passing 2 very difficult tests. You actually have to demonstrate knowledge. Fire investigators, you have to buy a private investigator's license. Licensing is not about knowing what you're doing. It's about paying the state money, filling out a form, and it's really about raising money and restraining trade. There's no state that currently licenses fire investigators actually requires them to know anything at all about fires. They've got to know about guns, they've got to know about surveillance, but they don't have to know anything at all about fires. So the qualifications, and we'll go to the chemists and engineers, they're going to have an education and training doing what they're doing. Your fire investigators, they may have training, but not any significant education. And without the education, without the basic scientific education, it's very difficult to absorb your training and understand what it's about, because you lack that foundation. But there are a lot of fire investigators who have a high school diploma or maybe an associate's degree, maybe a degree in criminal justice. It's a very scientific endeavor practiced by non-scientists. Now, we hope that they can be given a scientific mindset, but there are a lot of fire investigators that don't consider themselves scientists. In the chemical analysis of fire debris, you'll find some crime laboratories use drug chemists to analyze fire debris, and they may learn it, but just being able to operate a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer does not mean that you know how to analyze fire debris. You can identify heroin all day long, but gasoline is a whole other kettle of fish. Fire investigators are required to be qualified per standard called NFPA 1033, which is Professional Qualifications for Fire Investigator. And it sets forth the minimum qualifications. This is the book. In 2009, this book changed to require a certain knowledge base, and attorneys have been using this book to challenge the qualifications of fire investigators. It is a standard that applies to everyone in the business. It requires education, high school diploma, but it requires knowledge in 16 areas that a lot of fire investigators might not have. It also requires that fire investigators follow the scientific method in all aspects of their investigation. Maybe half of the people doing this work are qualified. And this is why I suggest that you challenge the qualifications of anyone who purports to be a fire expert. It's easier to challenge people on qualifications than on methodology, because fire is so complicated, qualification, not so much. Even if they're certified, and I've seen fire investigators with 30 years of experience and certification behind their names, they can't tell you what a watt is, or the basic units of energy, or describe the difference between energy and power. So they get training, fire investigators, typically from mentors who pass on their belief systems to apprentices. The U.S. Fire Academy and the ATF are now running advanced schools that teach the current knowledge. But beware, if the investigator's last school was before 1995, chances are they are schooled in a lot of stuff that isn't true. The two leading professional organizations, the International Association of Arson Investigators and the National Association of Fire Investigators, they offer both training and certification. The IAAI also offers training that's open and free to anyone who wants to go there. All that's required is a registration. And you can look up any of like 60 different subjects on fire investigation and get free training there. And I recommend it to everyone. It's set up for the high school graduate, so most lawyers can understand it. The certification, the IAAI offers a certified fire investigator, fire investigation technician, and evidence collection technician. The National Association of Fire Investigators offers a certified fire and explosion investigator, certified vehicle fire investigator, and certified fire investigation instructor. They both require continuing education for recertification. Many investigators are not certified, even though both of these organizations make that available. They're certified by their boss or by the state or by nobody. There's a very large number of people that are not certified by anyone that are going out and rendering origin and cause decisions. The IAAI program is accredited, and what we find is some people with the IAAI certification will claim a second certification, which is called resume puffing. The NAFI program is not currently accredited.
John, I know one of the things that we had talked about is that there are also training challenges in other disciplines, and questions and documents was one of those areas that you talked about with training. So, Linton, people often think of handwriting analysis when they think of question document examination, but forensic document examination is so much more. Could you tell us more about the nature of the work performed by a forensic document examiner and the training that's involved?
Yes, for many years, forensic document examiners were known as the handwriting guys. Typical, you guys just do the fraud and forgery types of cases. But it's much more than that. Forensic document examination encompasses anything that goes into the manufacture of a document. So what is a document? So any material which contains marks, symbols, or signs, either visible, partially visible, or invisible, that may convey a meaning or message. I just want to make one caveat here, is that graffiti is something that document examiners normally don't get into, because that's normally not, it's not handwriting, that's more of a drawing. But we have been able to solve some graffiti cases successfully when we have comparable specimens. The documents can include pencil or ink writings, typewriting. Yes, we still get typewriting cases, as many as before, but it's important for a document examiner to be trained in typewriting, especially when you have maybe like cold cases that come in that would have typewritten documents. Printer-generated materials, inkjet printing, laser printing, the old dot matrix printers, see them every so often. Photocopies, faxes, rubber stamps, postmarks, or other envelope information, and sometimes even graffiti. So forensic document examiners examine any documents about which a question has been raised considering their authenticity, source, content, or age. As I said, we often call handwriting experts, but the scope of work is far greater. So when to use a document examiner? Of course, handwriting examination. For most document examination labs, signatures and handwriting will comprise about 80% of the casework at minimum. There's some specialized labs, like the ICE lab, immigration lab in McLean, that they do lots of passports and visas, things like that, so they may have less handwriting examinations to do. Altered documents, erasures, indented writing, tracings, inks, and writing instruments. Now, indented writing is one of the types of writings that you can't see with the naked eye. That the document has to be processed in order to erase those indentations. Watermarks and trademarks. Watermarks can be used to date a document. Say this document could not have been prepared before this specific time, because this was when this actual watermark was made. Check writers we don't see very often again. Most checks are printed by laser printers or inkjet printers or handwritten. But again, for all cases, they pop up every so often. Charred documents, this comes in sort of in line with what John does in fire cases. You may have documents that are charred, and we may try to put them back together as much as possible, or try to bring up some of the ink information on those documents to see what was written on them. Rubber stamps, see often. Shredded documents, again, we can put shredded documents back together. There are actually software programs that can help to do that. Photographs, copies, and mechanically printed documents. In the old days, you would have a 4-part printing press, and for counterfeit documents, you may get the press and the printing plates, and you can associate those printed documents back to the plates and even the press. So indented impressions, bank robbery notes, threatening notes, anonymous documents, suicide notes, notepads, paper at crime scenes. So the notepads, paper at crime scenes is quite important, because quite often investigators miss them. It can be a piece of paper in a garbage bin. I had one case in San Diego a few years ago in which 2 people were found shot to death in a van in Chula Vista. In the van was a notepad. I processed the document impressions. Up came the phone number of a hotel room in Seattle. Then investigators then followed up on that. I found that the guy who did the shooting was a drug dealer in Seattle, came to San Diego. If a drug dealer went bad, and things. So without doing that, that information would have been lost. So this is just a short video to show how the ESDA works. The ESDA stands for Electrostatic Detection Apparatus, and is used to find indented writing.
The electrostatic detection apparatus, or ESDA, is an instrument used by forensic document examiners to see indented writing impressions left on a document by someone writing on the pages above that document. We are now going to use the ESDA on a robbery demand note collected as evidence in a bank robbery. Let's see if we can raise any indented writing. This writing is very difficult to see with the naked eye, and we need the ESDA to help make it visible. The ESDA is now turned on, and the document is placed on a steel bed. This will create a positive electrostatic charge to the document. A transparent film is pulled over the top of the document. The document and the film together act as an insulator for the electrical charges, creating what is called a capacitor arrangement. A high-voltage wand is now passed over the top of the document to create a negative charge. This takes about 20 seconds. The wand charges fiber particles in the indented impressions on the note. We will then use cascading glass beads covered with toner, and the toner particles will adhere to those electrostatically charged paper fibers. Here we can see some indented writing has developed. We can see there's a name, a phone number, and even an address left behind by someone who had written on pages above this note. The ESDA can restore indented writing left behind by writing on up to 7 layers of paper above a document. And indented impressions have been known to last as long as 50 years. Now we will make a transparency of the indented writing by using some adhesive film and a white backing sheet. This will make the indented writing we found much easier to read. We now have a good visualization of the indented writing left on the demand note. And more importantly, our investigators have some good leads in the case that they did not have earlier. The best part of all is how the original evidence document is still completely intact. Notice that no chemicals ever came into contact with the document. Nothing has touched the original document except electrical charges. Now that the ESDA work has been completed, the original demand note can go on to be processed for fingerprints. And the transparency containing the recovered indented writing can be submitted as additional evidence in the case. Thank you for taking the time to view this instructional video on the electrostatic detection apparatus. If you have any questions, please contact the San Diego Sheriff's Regional Crime Laboratory at 858-467-4600 and ask for the question documents section.
Okay, so that was a demonstration of the ESDA machine, again, electrostatic detection apparatus. That machine was actually developed at the London College of Printing in 1975. They were trying to erase fingerprints on cloth, unsuccessfully, but on the piece of cloth that they were using was a laundry label, and up came the impressions of handwriting. So purely by accident, it was discovered and implemented, and the machine has remained pretty much the same since then. It's a very simple machine, but very, very effective. Any cases, cases involving bank robbery notes, threatening notes, anonymous documents, suicide notes, and notepads must be processed with the ESDA. One note of caution is that if the document goes for processing for fingerprints with an anhydrine, for example, once the document gets wet, all the impressions are lost. So the document has to come to the question document section first. There are protocols in place at many labs to ensure that there's no DNA contamination between the ESDA plate and the document. So in any investigation like this, the document section should be gone to first. Then we have an instrument called the video spectral comparator that can detect alterations and obliterations. The VSC, again made by the same company who makes the ESDA, Boston Freeman. And there's other brand names as well, other companies that make similar instruments, but the VSC is probably the best known. Again, like the ESDA, the VSC testing is also non-destructive. The VSC is pretty much a very fancy camera that we can illuminate the document using visible lighting, infrared radiation, or ultraviolet lighting, some other different light sources, and then look at how those light sources or the reflections from the documents or transmissions interact with various camera filters in the machine. and we can get images of whatever we see, whatever we find, can be put into reports or put into court testimony so that the finder of fact can see what we saw. Again, it's non-destructive. There are specialist ink chemists who will have to who do more chemical testing. They'll need to punch samples from your document. Most document examiners won't do that. You have to go to a specialized ink chemist. That will be for things like are they the same ink or dating the document through inks. But the ink examinations that document examiners do are generally non-destructive. We can differentiate inks. We can never say two inks are the same or the same pen was used. All we can say is that using the techniques that we tried, we cannot differentiate the inks. So this is an example of detecting alterations with the visual spectral comparator. This is an altered check written in black ballpoint pen when viewed with visible light. So basically, how you would see it normally. And if you look at it, you can see in the 9, the eye has a bit of an issue with it, but it could just be a misinking pen. But under the VSC, you can see clearly using infrared radiation that there are two inks on that document. I'll go back to the first one. And then this is using infrared again, but this is using infrared luminescence, which is a different technique. But again, the ink behaves differently. But again, you can see clearly that there are at least two inks on this document. You find these types of documents in drug cases. Someone has a drug ledger or gambling, or even an accountant may have these types of documents where the officers knock on the door and they start trying to erase all the entries. So this is what the notebook looks like with visible light, with infrared. The top ink is just filtered off. Now, if you have the same ink or the same pen being used, then this won't work. But if you have different inks that behave differently, then it will work. If you have the same ink, then it becomes a matter of microscopy where you have to go into it, look through a microscope, look at the ink strokes and see what goes where and what doesn't go where, and try to figure out what was written. We even use things like Photoshop. Now we use quite often. We use a technique called a lab color, which is a function of Photoshop. We also have dichroic filters that we use as well. There's a combination of techniques that we use to try to differentiate the inks as much as possible. But again, if you can't differentiate them, we can never say that they're the same ink. All we can say is that using these techniques, we cannot differentiate the inks. Then we see lots of documents now with printing processes, and quite often these documents are altered or attempts are made to alter them. And this is a case involving printing processes. And the top image, quality, is printed with a laser printer. The bottom image, quality, was printed with an inkjet printer. So somebody went in and tried to fill the space in, but they used a different type of printer. And again, these types of images would be what would go into report and to court demonstration materials. Staple holes. Something as simple as a staple can be used to show that the page was substituted. And this one you can see clearly one page has 2 holes. The other 2 pages have 4 holes. I had one case in this in which it was an 8-page will. There were 2 pairs of staple holes and a staple between those staple holes. In the presence of both attorneys, I removed the existing staple. I found that it went through pages 1 through 7 and 8. But the other staple holes went through pages 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, not page 2 and not page 8. The will was inkjet printed, and the inks on pages 2 and 8 were different under the VSC than the rest of the inkjet printing. There was a signature that was written on the first page of the will that was indented on the pages 3 and 4, but not page 2. So it was fairly a substantial proof that pages 2 and 8 had been substituted. So simple thing as a staple can be very evidential. This was a case that I had when I was at the San Diego lab. It's quite an interesting case. It was a double homicide. This young man had killed his girlfriend, who was 18, and then her friend, when she came to look for her, they were both 18, he buried them in a shallow grave in Escondido, which is a little town north of San Diego. While he was in custody, he sent a 4-page document to his new girlfriend from prison. It was written in pencil. At the back of page 2, about halfway down, he says, "After you read this, erase it or destroy it." She erased it and kept it. So the investigators brought it into the lab to see if I could read the erased entries. And again, there were pencil entries that were erased, so they're a bit difficult. Using the VSC, I was able to bring up some of them because pencil writing is made of graphite. Graphite is opaque to infrared, so you're able to adjust the contrast even more then. Side lighting didn't help very much, and the acid didn't help very much because the papers had been distorted, the fibers. So using different lighting techniques, we look at the document from different areas with oblique lighting. And then I went to court to a motion in limine in which the defense tried to keep this evidence out, because the only evidence in this case was the document evidence and trace evidence. There's no DNA evidence. So the judge says, "No, I will let you testify, but I want the jury to see what you saw." Which gave me a couple of sleepless nights because it took me another 10, 12 hours to decipher these entries. So thank goodness we had Photoshop. So we took the best images that we had of the documents using oblique lighting. Then using photo merge, we stitched them together to recreate the document. Now you can see the lines where the documents, where the stitching was done. I left those lines in to show what was done. We could have cleaned it up very nicely, but I wanted the jury to see exactly what was done and where we had stitched it. In that case, the handwriting was actually quite evidential, and it was used towards convicting this person of first-degree murder, 2 first-degree murders, and he got life without parole. So it was quite an interesting case. We see these more often now, computer fonts, where people try to, again, add entries to already printed documents. And you have very, very subtle differences in the fonts that we use to differentiate them. For example, you have Times Roman and Times New Roman. Times Roman was introduced by Apple in 1992, Times New Roman by Microsoft in 1993. And this was important in a case I had where someone claimed that the document was typewritten in 1971. It was typewritten with it was printed using Times New Roman, which we knew came out in 1993. So subtle differences in fonts can be used to differentiate entries and to see whether any entries have been added or erased. So then we come to levels of opinions, and we have what's called a 9-point scale. It's an ASTM scale called ESTM E1658-08, Guidelines for Expressing Conclusions of Forensic Document Examiners. And at the top of the scale, what we might call number 1 is identification, a definite conclusion of identity with the highest degree of certainty. Now, does this mean that we're 100% sure? No, we can never be 100% sure. For example, if I'm asked, if I identify someone or identify a writer, I'm asked, how certain are you? My answer is, the only way I can be more certain is if I actually saw him write it. So is there doubt? There is doubt, but there's very, very little doubt, and I'm very certain of my opinion. Then we have a strong probability, which is again very persuasive, but critical features are missing. For example, we may be dealing with a photocopy, maybe a poor, lesser quality copy, or we may have a limited amount of handwriting. And then you have probable. The evidence is strong, but falls short of certainty. More likely than not. Indications, only a few features of significance, a very weak opinion. This is an opinion that should never be used in court. It's pretty much an opinion for the investigators, and actually many document examiners do not use indications because we find it tends to be misused. And then we go the other way down. Indications did not, probably did not, strong probability did not, elimination, and no conclusion. Elimination is a very difficult opinion to give because you're saying that there's no way that someone could have written this handwriting or signature. Because handwriting is behavioral, there's so many things that could affect it that what you're interpreting as a difference could actually be a variation due to age, illness, medication. I've had cases where someone wrote their signature on the running engine of a car. Lots of shakiness in it. Everything else was fine except for the shakiness. So it's a very difficult conclusion to make, but it can be done. And then we start off with no conclusion. And this is the opinion that I guess the most frustrating to investigators and attorneys. Why no conclusion? I'll go into that in the next slide. I just want to say that the pattern of thought now at OSAC, for example, where the standards are being developed, is that the identification and elimination opinions are going to be removed. So you're going to have more like a 5-point scale where you have a strong probability or probable, probably did not, strong probability did not, and no conclusion, or you may have a likelihood ratio approach where you're giving a likelihood of the possibility of two assumptions or two hypotheses, which one is more likely than the other. So why do we have no conclusion? The question writing is of limited quantity. This is one of the problems that we had, especially in labs like this, San Diego Sheriff's Lab and any other law enforcement labs, is that quite often we have a very small amount of handwriting to deal with. For example, if you have a date, it just may not be enough in there to identify someone. You have to remember with handwriting is meant to be read. It's meant to be easily understood. A signature is meant to be an identifier. So I tend to treat signatures differently from handwriting. And there are neuroscience theories that would support this, theories of motor control and on motor programs. Then you have the question writings were too distorted or disguised, which is someone trying to change their handwriting, which can be done sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully. The less amount of writing you have, the more successful the disguise can be. And sometimes the examiner can say it's disguise. I can't say who did it. The known writings, again, are too limited or contain disguise or distortion. The known writings do not contain characters present in the question writing. And this happens more often than you would think. And I will give you one really bad example that I had in San Diego. The question writing was, let's say, John Lentini was the signature. The investigator got the defendant or the suspect to sit down and write 15 times, Freddie the freeloader fell on the floor. And this is just very, very frustrating to any examiner and frustrating to the investigator as well, because then we say, sorry, we can't help it, there's nothing comparable here. So no conclusion is can be frustrating, but is also useful as well. Again, it depends. Sometimes attorneys call us to say we have no conclusion, and for these reasons. So for training, again, and we have some parallels with fire investigation in the beginning. Right now, for example, membership of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences Question Document section, American Society of Question Document Examiners, and the American Board of Forensic Document Examiners require a minimum of a 4-year bachelor's degree. And we see most people coming in now are coming in with master's degree. There are other certifying boards. There's another board certified through the Forensic Specialties Accreditation Board, BFDE. They may have different requirements. I'm not certain of their requirements. And there may be other boards, alleged boards, who are not accredited by FSAB. The ASQDE, AAFS, and ABFD require a minimum 2 to 3 year full-time training program. When I trained back in 1986, it was 2 years. When I had trainees back in 2005, 2006, it was 3 years, because there's so much more to do now with, for example, just printers and photocopiers are a whole other module that needs to be learned. And you still have to learn about typewriting, because you never know when it's going to come up in a cold case. You must have a continuing education. If you're certified by the American Board of Forensic Document Examiners, you have to collect 40 points over a 5-year period, which is achieved through attending conferences, presenting papers, publishing papers, and doing other professional activities acceptable to the board. And other boards may have the same sort of requirements. For the American Society of Question Document Examiners, research and publication requirements are required. To become a member of ASQDE, you have to present a paper at an annual meeting to become a member. And to maintain your membership, you have to present a paper at least once every 3 years. Otherwise, unless you have extenuating circumstances, maybe give them a 1-year waiver, but after that, you're out. Even for guests coming to the meetings, guests are allowed to attend 3 times, and then they have to present a paper. When the ASQD was founded back in 1942, it was founded by Albert S. Osborne, and the function of the society, as he saw it, was for research, and he wanted everyone to participate. He didn't want anyone being baggage, and that's the same principles we use now.
Human performance factors and scientific and technological advances often drive the research needs in forensic disciplines. Linton, what type of research has been done related to forensic document examination, and what are the current research needs?
One of the main critiques of handwriting by some law professors is that, look, we don't need handwriting examiners. A jury can do this. It's handwriting. How difficult can it be? Now, as I said earlier, handwriting is taught so that everyone can read it, everyone can understand it. So everyone's handwriting will have some characteristics that are similar to a group of people. So the first set of testing that was done was to say, okay, are the experts actually better than the lay people? And testing was done by Professor Cam at Drexel University, and also by Doctors Found and Rogers at La Trobe University in Australia independently. And both results found that the experts performed the lay people significantly, especially when it came to identifying a simulation. Now, I cannot say the word forgery. Forgery is a legal term. So I would never testify to something being a forgery. I could testify to being a simulation of someone else's signature or handwriting. So that was one of the initial gaps. Then Tom Bastrick, who's a document examiner locally in this area, with the University of Central Florida, they've just completed a really interesting study on measuring the frequency of occurrence of handwriting characteristics in the U.S. population. For example, how many times does this type of E occur in the population? And there could be like 8 different types of uppercase E's. So that's a very interesting research. It was just published through NIJ, and that's going to be ongoing research. I know that Tom is now doing research in similar research in numbers. How often do these type of numbers occur? And I think the aim of that eventually is to develop a database or databases where an examiner can go into the database and come up with a quantitative factor for the frequency of occurrence of this character or this combination of characters, which would help a long way to moving the examination process from being subjective to more objective, which is the key. Empirical research is being done. Dr. Mauro Molino at the University of Kentucky State University just completed a 3-year project through NIJ and published a 1,500-page report available on the NIJ's website. And what she did was, she looked at experts and laypersons using eye tracking techniques. With eye tracking, the two-way eye tracker, you sit and you look at the signatures, the question signature, the known signatures, and the eye tracker tracks to see what you're looking at and what you're spending more time on. And she found differences in behaviors between the experts and the laypersons. And again, the experts significantly outperform the laypersons. Again, particularly when it came to I'll use the word forgeries so everyone can understand. But if you think of it, at Christmas, February 14th, people get cards and, oh yes, I know this handwriting, because you're meant to recognize the handwriting. Yet, at Christmas time, you see a card, you don't have to look at the return address, you know who had. So it is easily identifiable by most people, genuine writing. The problem is there's someone simulate, Anne Viv's handwriting. That's when the layperson tends to fall down, because it's very, very difficult. They also may tend to not appreciate the various factors that can go into affecting the behavior of handwriting. I had one case a couple of years ago in which there were 12 question signatures, and when I first looked at it, I said, these don't look good. And then I got the gentleman's medical records that had over 300 signatures over 5 years. And his signatures changed from hour to hour depending on his medication. It was just fascinating. So for a layperson looking at these things, they would say, okay, yeah, these are different, but they don't factor in the causes to what did cause this variation. That's another reason why a document examiner may sometimes say, time out, we're inconclusive. There's so much going on here that we can't explain, we don't know. So a lot of we're encouraging our practitioners to engage with academia in empirical research. At the American Society of Question Document Examiners meeting in San Diego in August of this year, the first half day will be a workshop by NIJ and NIST on research grants, how to apply for grants and things like that. Most document examiners have said they will not be researchers. They bachelor's degree, master's degrees. So we need the arrangements with the statisticians and so on to develop research projects to validate what we do, and even say, hey, you know what, you guys can't do that, or if you're not good enough. We need to know that, and we need to either make it better or tell the courts, sorry, we can't testify this again because it doesn't meet the bar. So this was the CAM studies, error rates. This was published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. So he found that professional document examiners are significantly better than college-educated non-experts in performing writer identification. Another study, he found that professional document examiners incorrectly identify 6.5% of unknown documents with documents. Laypersons incorrectly identified 38.3% of these documents. So the laypersons were nearly 6 times more likely to make an error than the expert. This was our signatures. The document examiners experienced a 0.49% error rate. The laypersons, 6.47%, so nearly 13 times more likely. Again, as I said, signatures should be treated differently because signatures are a small amount of writing and it tends to be overlearned. As a quick example, it's found that people with Alzheimer's who are losing their capacity to write, their handwriting deteriorates faster than their signatures, which is important because if you have a holographic will, the handwriting may look pretty bad, but the signature may look pretty good. And also found that men deteriorate faster than women. Again, using hand-printed documents, professional document examiners, 9.3% error rate, laypersons, 40.45% error rate. Latrobe study, again, similar studies, different populations, different scientists working on this, got very similar results to the CAM study. So the studies by Dr. Kam and Dr. Found, who unfortunately Dr. Found passed away last October in a very untimely manner, repeatedly confirmed that experts significantly perform laypersons in handwriting examination tasks. So if you have a case before a jury, you don't want the jury making the decision as to whether this handwriting is genuine or non-genuine. Furthermore, if you try to get handwriting excluded, let's say you're a prosecutor, if you're a defense attorney, you want to get the handwriting excluded, and you do, then it means that also your expert is excluded. So you have sort of a double whammy there, where the two expert opinions can come into court. So the absence of expert testimony can lead to incorrect conclusions by lay persons. This doesn't mean that experts can be wrong. The evidence has shown that, but the error rate is much lower than lay persons. Also remember that with the lay persons, they're going to have a short amount of time to examine these documents in a jury room, for example. They may have poor quality copies, and there may be peer pressure involved in these examinations. There may be one very strong-minded member of the jury who sort of leads the rest. So I would recommend highly that let the experts testify. So if you look at expert witness credentials, the document examiner should be board certified. So there are two boards certified through the Forensic Specialties Accreditation Board. There's the American Board of Forensic Document Examiners, and then there's the Board of Forensic Document Examiners. The experts should be a member of the question document section of AAFS. And this is important, not just a member of AAFS, but a member of the question document section, because we have specific requirements for document examiners, particularly when it comes to training for membership. So you can join any member of the academy, for example, the general section, but if you're not a properly trained document examiner, you will not be allowed into the question document section. Similar requirements for organizations such as the ASQD, American Society of Question Document Examiners, must have a 2 to 3 year training program full-time. Other organizations say they're okay with maybe 4 to 5 years part-time. There's no testing to be done as to which of these are better, if any are better. That testing, I think, should be done. And then, does your witness is your witness professionally active? Do they give workshops? Do they attend and participate in conferences? And participate is also important. You can attend many conferences and don't pick up anything. Some people go to a conference, they pay the fee, and then you don't see them until the banquet night or something like that. So it's important that they participate, they present in these conferences, and see how active your witness is.
Okay, thank you. John, we're going to look at some of those same topics as related to fire analysis. And the flashover video that we saw in the very beginning, it really illustrates how difficult it can be to obtain evidence and make determinations in fire-related investigations. So what type of research has been done related to what can and cannot be reliably determined in fire investigations?
Certainly there hasn't been enough research done in fire analysis. Back in the day, we used to light condemned houses on fire, put them out too soon in order to teach people to recognize arson. We've learned since that in order to do proper research, you've got to let that fire burn long enough so that it simulates the actual experience of the fire investigator. So what we do now, the analysis and the research is done mainly by fire protection engineers. They were the ones that had all the money and ran all the good tests back in the day. But they were interested in how to prevent flashover, how long flashover was going to take. And they ran hundreds of tests and never once went in and looked at the aftermath, which was a horrible waste. But that's the way it was. The fire protection engineers, people that are designing sprinkler systems and buildings, would run the tests. Investigators now piggyback onto that. So, for example, Underwriters Laboratories is running a series of tests on ventilation for firefighting, but we're also using it as fire investigation. Investigators used to really hate scientists. They weren't from a scientific background. Most investigators were firefighters who somehow became fire investigators. Early on, it was actually punishment duty or duty for people who could no longer extinguish fires. They would be put in the investigation unit. Now it's a much more desirable position to have, but for a long time, until the turn of the century, and I mean this century, people looked down on scientists, and they thought that the scientists didn't contribute to fire investigation. But things are better since 2000. So you saw the video, and it showed the floor burning. It used to be that low-level burning was considered an indicator of arson because everybody knows fire burns up and out. And so if it burns down, it must have had help. Somebody must have used an accelerant. That's not true. But people thought that for years and years. And so we spent most of the 1990s trying to educate the fire investigation community. And again, these people are sometimes resistant to change or education, but trying to tell them that, look, if a fire gets fully involved, it's going to burn the floor. As a result of learning about flashover, we learned that floors burn in unaccelerated fires. You saw that chair started on fire. There was no gasoline in the room, and yet before we were done, the carpet was burning. And after that fire, if somebody had gone in and documented it, they would have seen that the floor was all burned. This would have been thought of as something that indicated arson back in the day. And this was, that film was from 1984. So in the 1990s, the fire professionals, the fire scientists tried to teach the rest of the fire investigation world not to get so excited about burning on the floors, even irregular burning on a floor. It happens during a fire. And it took a while to teach people not to call a fire arson just because the floor was burned. And we've finally, I think, persuaded just about everybody that that's the case. There is a rear guard. Most of that rear guard has got hair the color of mine or less hair. They tend to be the old people that just never accepted that floors can burn. So currently, the emphasis that we have is on getting investigators to understand the effects of ventilation and how that might impact the determination of the area of origin. Now, finding the area of origin is a fire investigator's core competence. That's what they're supposed to be good at. There has been some research recently that has led us to believe that fire investigators maybe aren't all that good at determining the area of origin. And this is because of a lack of understanding of ventilation. This is a test that was conducted in Las Vegas at an arson investigators meeting in 2005. That's an ATF agent standing outside that test burn cell that's been set up as a bedroom. They lit it on fire and allowed it to burn beyond flashover. You can see the air goes in the bottom, the smoke and fire comes out the top. And what happened was we had 53 people attending the conference, and they were asked to go into this room and pick a quadrant where the fire started. And most investigators picked the quadrant directly across from the door as the place where the fire started, because there was a large fire pattern on the wall there. It went all the way to the floor, all the way to the ceiling. It was the heaviest and deepest char in the room. The actual origin, unfortunately, was in the upper left quadrant. And here's the fire pattern. This is a V-shaped pattern. It's caused by the intersection of a conical fire plume. There was a trash can below that white area, and the plume came up and scorched the wall. Unfortunately, even though this pattern survived the fire, most of the fire investigators didn't recognize the importance of that plume, and they were misled by the other one. So this is a slide from the ATF agent who ran the test, and he said 53 experienced fire investigators were asked to examine the scene and indicate which quadrant they thought the fire originated in. I've changed that to 53 participating individuals for reasons we'll get into, but they might not have all been experienced fire investigators. But here's the pattern that everyone thought, or that a lot of people thought was the origin of the fire. 3 of the 53 got it right. Not one person determined the actual point of origin, but 3 out of 53 found the upper left quadrant to be where the fire started. Not a very impressive error rate. Well, actually, it was impressive. It was over 90% got it wrong. And when the word of this test got out, this is when the spin machine started in earnest. People tried to explain it. They said, oh, really, it's okay. Fire investigators know what they're doing. This was an anomaly. They said, oh, that's not valid data. Investigators weren't allowed to shovel out the scene. They weren't allowed to conduct interviews or collect samples, and some of the people are not qualified. Well, you could have shoveled that scene completely out. You could have interviewed the witnesses that saw it coming out the door. They would have still gotten it wrong. And in terms of the qualifications, there is a fine line between a numerator and a denominator. Only a fraction of you will get this. But there's only so much you can do with the data. If you want to say that instead of having 53 qualified investigators, we had only 30 qualified investigators, you still got only 3 people getting it right. You can't fix that number 3. So they repeated the experiment. This time they did it a little more, with more instrumentation in an indoor laboratory. This is at the ATF Fire Research Laboratory in Ammendale, Maryland. They actually rebuilt the building. They instrumented it with thermocouples and gauges to measure different concentrations of gases, and anemometer to measure the wind speed in and out. And they did a pretty good job of reproducing the fire. They also modeled it. Computer fire modeling is a very interesting discipline. It's got its uses to help people understand what's going on in a fire. And this is the production of that big fire pattern coming in the door. It was 150 kilowatts per square meter. That's a lot of kilowatts. That's like 10 space heaters in a 3 by 3 foot space. It's a lot of energy. And it creates a pattern that looks like this. Well, what they did with the model was they asked it to show the oxygen concentration. And this is just before 12 seconds after flashover. This is the oxygen concentration. And 8 inches above the floor, you can see the oxygen coming in the bottom of the door. And what we have hypothesized is that we've got this thing called a floor jet, where this blast of cold, fresh air comes in at the bottom of the opening while the smoke is going out the top. And this is just, it's simple mass balance. If you have a whole lot of smoke coming out the top, something's going to replace that, and that's the air that will come in the bottom of that doorway. This is a sideways view of it, and the oxygen is in red. And there's almost no oxygen at the top of the wall there. There's the only place where there's any oxygen is right opposite that, right at the doorway. That's where the fresh air is coming in. You can't have burning without oxygen. And so the oxygen actually takes over, and what we call this is a ventilation-controlled fire. Again, there's the path of the oxygen coming in. So the experiment with individuals was repeated in 2007 in Oklahoma City. This time there were 3 different fires, 70 fire investigators, and they had the first fire, they allowed it to burn for 30 seconds beyond flashover and then extinguished it. Most of the fires that we investigate as fire investigators have burned for several minutes beyond flashover, maybe several tens of minutes beyond flashover, but we've got to start somewhere. The second fire went for 70 seconds beyond flashover, and the third fire went for 3 minutes beyond flashover. And like they did in Las Vegas, they asked these fire investigators to go through and pick a quadrant. So in the first fire, we got excuse me, 70 responses out of 70 people. 59 were correct. So we had a 16% error rate. Not a particularly good result, but that's what it was. The second fire, there were 6 people that decided undetermined. They did not pick a quadrant. Of the 64 who responded, 44 got it correct. We're talking about 31% error rate with a 1-minute fire. And the third fire, excuse me, got something in my throat. The third fire, we had 53 responses, so there were 17 people elected not to pick a quadrant. 13 were correct. That's 25%. When you think about it, that's 2 coin tosses. You could go into the room, blindfold yourself, spin around in a circle, and pick a quadrant at random, and that you would have 25% correct. There's another experiment in 2012 done with photographs and data. There were 587 people, fire investigators, elected to participate. Demographics were gathered from all of these people. They viewed photos and data from a fire that burned for only 1 minute beyond flashover. 1 minute. Again, not very realistic. We had a 22 to 26% error rate in that test. So the error rate is, in determining origin based on reading fire patterns, is pretty high. To date, there is no peer-reviewed literature that shows that fire investigators' use of pattern interpretation to determine the origin leads to correct results if the fire burned fully involved for more than 3 minutes. None. So this is one avenue where fire investigators would love to have the error rate that document examiners have. And it's one area where they can be challenged on the reliability of their methodology, because so far the profession has been unable to prove that it knows what it's doing when determining origin. So what we've learned is that the availability of oxygen is what controls the progress of a fully involved structure fire. And what we're going to show now is an illustration of that. It's a very elegant experiment involving igniting heptane, which is very similar to gasoline in its properties, in a closed compartment. So we had this pool of heptane. It's been lit on fire, and it's burning in a place where there's limited ventilation. There is a slit cut into the top of the box on the right, and another one cut into the bottom of the box on the right. So the products of combustion can go out the top, and the air can come in the bottom. And you can see now that there's sort of a wind that's apparent that's blowing from right to left where the air is coming in. As time goes by, though, the flame moves completely off of the pool, and it will do this for a little while, and it make the most remarkable transition, because what's happening is the box is filling up with the products of combustion, with heptane vapors that aren't burning, and the oxygen in the compartment is being depleted. And just about now, the only place where there's any oxygen available is over in the lower right. That's where it's coming in. And the fire moves completely over there. And there's going to be, if this was a compartment with furniture, there would be much more damage around this where the oxygen comes in, as opposed to where the fuel is or where the fire started. The fire is burning much more intensely where there is oxygen, and not at all where we know the fire started above the heptane. So this controls everything. It's a very elegant little experiment. We can move on, I think. There we go. Fire analysis research is expensive in both time and materials. That little experiment that I just showed didn't cost a whole lot, but it took a while to set it up. But setting up full-sized fire experiments is very, very difficult. The best experiments that we conduct these days happen if we can find a hotel or an apartment building where all of the floor plans are exactly alike, and we can repeat the experiment over and over and see what changes and what doesn't. But there are so many different variables and different ways you can change your fire just by opening a window early in the fire, or having it open late in the fire, or leaving a door open, or changing a couch for a chair. All of those things make it very difficult to simplify and generalize what's going on. But what we do know, what we have learned, is that oxygen is what's in charge. And when the flashover occurs, the oxygen concentration goes from like 21% in a room down close to 0. And the temperature immediately begins to drop when the oxygen gets used up. So that's where we are with fire research.
Are there universities that are studying this type of information? How is the funding? Is the funding coming through?
We are getting some funding now from the National Institute of Justice as a result of that 2009 report. It mentioned fire.
Report, yes.
The NAS report. It mentioned fire. And so fire is a forensic science.
Yes.
It's officially a forensic science, something that not a lot of fire investigators will necessarily agree with. They will say, I'm not a scientist, I'm a fire investigator. Well, that was okay in the 70s.
Yeah, and specifically, I think I have a portion of that report, and it says, "quote experiment should be designed to put arson investigation on a more solid scientific footing." So, has that progressed?
It has actually, surprisingly. I saw almost exactly those words in a report that was produced in 1977, saying that we needed to do a lot more research to put fire investigation on a more solid scientific footing. And not much happened, but there is work now that's happening. NIJ particularly has funded a number of groundbreaking experiments, some of which are run over at the ATF laboratory. They'll bring in an outside contractor that's got the grant, and they use the facilities at the ATF laboratory. So there's a lot of interesting work happening, but it's really slow.
What should an attorney look for in an expert in the area of fire analysis?
Yeah, hopefully you want to look for somebody that owns at least a bachelor's degree. You won't find that in about half of the fire investigation world, but I mean, if you're looking for an expert to assist in a criminal defense, for example, you want someone with some experience doing that. You want someone who has been certified and who continues to be certified. And there's people that aren't certified that hold themselves out as experts, but those people are likely to get beaten up. And you want to vet them with NFPA 1033.
And so, yeah.
Here we go.
There you go. Yeah.
So you look at their credentials, you look at their track record. You got to especially make sure that they know how to talk to a jury. Some fire experts have tremendous stores of knowledge, but aren't able to effectively communicate that to someone who doesn't have that big store of knowledge. And also, you want to not necessarily look for somebody that's old, because age and experience are not exactly the same thing. You can have a person with 20 years experience, or you can have a person with 1 year of experience that he's repeated 19 times. It just depends on what they learn from their experience. So you just talk to them, make sure that they can articulate what is a difficult subject, and somebody that appreciates what a difficult subject it is. If they say they're looking for the lowest and deepest char, you probably want to talk to someone else.
Okay, and you can continue on with it.
All right.
Yeah.
So the literature that a capital case litigator would want to become familiar with is first of all NFPA 921. This is the Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigations. It's now in its 9th edition. It was first published in 1992. A lot of people hated it when it came out. But since then, right around the turn of the century, people decided that they had better accept that scientific method for investigating fires is the only way to go. NFPA 1033 is a much smaller document. This is the one that is a standard for qualifications for a fire investigator. Now, NFPA 921 is a guide. And you can ask someone, why didn't you follow NFPA 921? And they will say, it's only a guide. Well, that's true. Then you say, well, why didn't you follow the guide instead of why didn't you follow the standard? Now, the question is the same. But with NFPA 1033, it's a standard. It applies to everyone who investigates fires, whether they're a chemist or an engineer or a fire investigator. Anyone who's involved has got to have the basic minimum qualifications. And this can be used by a court during a qualifications challenge. I mean, this is a standard that the profession has imposed on itself, and it would provide a lot of guidance to a judge in determining whether the person is qualified. I was once in a courtroom where the fire marshal got up on a witness chair and was asked to describe the combustion of hydrogen, which is the simplest of all combustion reactions. And the fire marshal looked like a deer in the headlights. And the judge, sua sponte, popped up and said, I'm sorry, if you don't know H2O, you will not be rendering opinion testimony in my courtroom. And anytime they got even close to an opinion, the judge said, that sounds like an opinion. And a person was limited to being a fact witness, and as such was not very effective, and the defendant was acquitted. I didn't have to testify. This document here was produced by the Department of Justice in 2000, and what it says is, follow NFPA 921, please. If you've got a dead body, if you think it's an incendiary fire, if it's a really big fire, follow NFPA 921. It's right in there. It's very effective if the witness wants to resist NFPA 921, because if they don't accept it as authoritative, then of course you're not allowed to cross-examine them on the document if they don't accept it as authoritative. Most fire investigators know better than to not accept it as authoritative, but some of them don't. And there's ways to get them to say, well, everybody else says it's an authority. This is a new book just out in February of this year, Forensic Science Reform, and it has a chapter on arson in it, written by yours truly. And it's got a study of the Cameron Todd Willingham case out of Texas, which chastened the authorities in Texas to the point where Texas is now the leader in forensic science reform. And finally, there's this book, which is written to be accessible to people that don't have a science degree. Plain language, it's written for the average fire investigator, but I have found that attorneys are able to grasp it pretty well.
All right, thank you. Linton, I know that when I was doing some research, I was looking at the Scientific Working Group for Document Examiners on their website, and they have quite a few standards available and accessible. So that's a good place, a good reference point. Are there any other reference points and validation methodologies that that would be important to know?
Right. Yeah. The SWGDoc website, www.swgdoc.org, is still up and running. SWGDoc, which is the Scientific Working Group for Documents, is no longer funded, but through one generous examiner, they have kept the website up and running just in case. On that website, you can download about I think about 19 standards. Most of these standards have been published through ASTM. Unfortunately, if you go to ASTM, you'll have to pay about $30 to get a copy of the standard. Now that the American Academy of Forensic Sciences has established the Academy Standards Board, it is hoped that standards developed through OSAC or from other areas will be published through the Academy Standards Board, which is a standards development organization. Those will be free to the public. So that's the plan in the future. Hopefully it'll be successful. The Academy Standards Board is working under a grant right now, and again, it all depends on funding. Just regards to the studies, we have the Mauro study funded through NIJ, the Bastrix study through NIJ, and Lisa Hansen and Professor Srihari. Lisa Hansen was a document examiner in Minnesota, and Professor Srihari is at University of Buffalo in New York, State University of New York in Buffalo. They did a longitudinal study, NIJ-funded research, looking at students over a number of years as they progressed through the grades, and look at how their handwriting changed. So these were the three of the major NIJ projects over the past few years. There has been criticism of the recondite methodology. People say, you guys say you know what you do, but no one else knows what you do. What exactly do you do? So we need various black box studies, and in that you have, for example, questioned and known writings or signatures or printers or whatever, and they're submitted blind to an examiner or a group of examiners, and then we get an error rate back. Say how good are these examiners are determining whether these things are authentic or non-authentic. And then we have white box studies which need to be done to what is exactly going on in the examiner's mind. Dr. Merlino's study at Kentucky State University using the eye tracking was a semi-white box study, white box and black box study. We need much more of those types of studies. Handwriting is behavioral, and I want to emphasize that it does not mean personality. As John had in his slide, you have gasoline, you have heptane, which behave similarly. And you have other flammable substances that may have different behaviors. Handwriting is similar in that people behave differently. They may if you're standing up and writing, if you're writing at a counter, if you're sitting, if you're lying in bed writing on your pillow, a document on your pillow, that may affect your handwriting. There's lots of variations in your handwriting. In one of the major texts in document examination, handwriting examination, Facts and Fundamentals by Huber and Hedrick, they list about 20 factors that must be considered. Now, all of these must be researched. There must be empirical research that goes into this. It has to be funded, of course. There are lots of small studies going around by individuals. Right now, there's some research between University of California, San Diego, Professor Michael Caligiuri, with examiners at LAPD and LASO, and myself included in that, looking at hand printing, looking at kinematic studies. The kinematic studies look at what's exactly happening when you're writing. So we use like a Wacom tablet. You pick up the handwriting, and it goes through a laptop running Movilizer software, and there are about 26 parameters that we can look at: speed, velocity, pen pressure, amount of tremor, things like that. So that can give us a pretty good idea what's actually happening in when someone's writing, and then we need to see how good examiners can evaluate that from a static signature on ink line on paper. So first of all, we need to know the ground truth, and then how good is the examiner at getting that ground truth through observing a static signature. The other area of research that's going to be very active is research into digital signatures. You go to many point of sales areas and you actually sign with a stylus on a plastic pad, or sometimes even sign with your finger. Some research has been going on into that. The first time I was asked to sign with my finger, I told the guy, why just don't take my print? And that's more reliable than me signing with my finger. And anyone who signed with their finger knows, is very different every time you sign. However, some people have been doing some research on that, and the results have been fascinating. That is actually quite individual. Tani Dewhurst at La Trobe University in Melbourne, she completed a PhD thesis last year, 2 years ago. And one of her chapters, which is not published, was looking at using a similar Wacom tablet. When you write with a pen, the tablet can pick up to about 5 centimeters above the paper. So it captures what's called the air strokes. Now, in document examination now, we can say that something, a signature is a simulation, not written by the genuine person. Who did the simulation? That's very, very difficult to do, especially if it's a good simulation. So generally we say, yes, we can say it's a simulation. Who did it? We can't say that, generally. But with the digital signature, with the research that Tanya has done, we found that the air strokes are very individual to the writer. So someone simulating, they don't even know what they can look at the ink on the paper, but they have no idea what their hand is doing off the paper, and it's consistent throughout. So we can say, yeah, that's a simulation, and person A is a simulator. So I think that's going to be the future of signature examination, and quite a bit of research will be going into those areas.
We do have a question, and that is, what are white and black box studies?
Okay, a black box study is so basically you want to know how reliable this profession is at this particular task. You don't want to know how they do it. You just want to know, are they reliable or not? What is their error rate? For example, in question documents, you may give a group of question signatures and a group of specimen signatures, and then looking at how often the correct answers arrived at, you can tell, okay, these people have a 90% accuracy rate, 95%, or if it's down to like 60%, okay, well maybe they shouldn't be testifying to this particular task in court. So these are what the black box studies are for. I know that there have been some done in fingerprints, and I think in firearms as well. The white box study, you pretty much go into the methodology to look at what the examiner is actually, the training, what they're actually looking at, and how they're developing their opinion. Basically, how do they arrive at the bases for their opinion, and do they do the same time every time? Are they certain tasks that give more problems than other tasks using the same methods? So those would be the white box studies.
Okay. Thank you. Of particular interest to our target audience, what tips could you provide for working with an expert witness in forensic document examination?
The first thing I can tell any attorney is please meet with your witness before testimony. Have a pre-trial conference, and I can't emphasize how important that is. You want to be on the same page with the expert and vice versa. Neither side wants surprises. And the worst example I've had in this was in San Diego when I asked the prosecutor for a pretrial conference. He said, "Oh no, I've dealt with you guys many times before. We don't need that." So I go into court, I'm on the stand, and his first question he asked is, "Mr. Mohammed, how long have you been looking at fingerprints?" And I leaned back in my chair and I looked at him and said, "Counsel, I've never examined a fingerprint in my life." And then he started scrambling. So something as basic as that, and the jury was actually laughing at him, but it was so basic. So please have a pre-trial conference with your expert. Please do not try to change your expert's opinions. They must be comfortable to what they're testifying with. And most experts, I would say, well-trained experts, ethical experts, will not change their opinions, and they'll give you the proper weight of this is what my opinion means. And somebody change to say, "Well, I can use you," or "No, we'll have another trial technique."
And do you have some suggestions for cross-examination and direct
Yes.
examination strategies that would be useful?
Yes, again, with direct examination, the examiner should have demonstrative charts. Wilson Harrison, who was a British document examiner, passed away now many years ago, said that whatever you cannot demonstrate is not evidence. And that's something I've sort of been my mantra, because it keeps me honest. That, okay, there's no ipse dixit. This is what I'm seeing. This is why I came to my opinion. I demonstrated through charts, maybe either paper charts or a PowerPoint charts, presentation, annotated. I also do that in my reports for direct. And for direct and cross, the other advice I have is keep it brief. I gave the example, I was talking to you earlier. I was testifying in Guildford Crown Court in Surrey a few years ago in a criminal case where the balance of proof is the proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think I testified to the probability that the defendant wrote the signature. So I went through my chart and everything and showed the similarities and the reasons for my opinion. And the defense barrister gets up. He says, Mr. Mohammed, you said my client probably wrote the signature. I said, yes, counsel. He said, so there is doubt in your mind. I said, yes. He said, thank you, no further questions. And that was, to me, was one of the best cross-examinations I've ever had. It was brief. It was to the point. He got to the weight of the evidence. The jury was happy because they didn't have to listen to me go through my chart again. So I would say keep it brief, cut to the chase, and get to the weight of the evidence.
Okay. And we do have another question, and that both of you could weigh in on. Both of you talked about OSAC, and what is it, and what are your two areas involved in OSAC? So I'll start with Linton, and then we'll go on to John.
Okay. After the SWIGs, the scientific working groups, there were maybe about 20, 25 of them in each discipline. After their funding was cut, OSAC, which is the Organization of Scientific Area Committees, was formed and funded by NIST, I think through NIJ. And what this does is basically divided the various forensic disciplines into bodies that did similar work to what the SWIGs did in order to develop standards for the various areas of discipline. My particular area, I was on the Scientific Area Committee for Pattern and Physics Evidence, which was question documents, prints, shoe prints, blood spatter, and firearms. So we were trying to get all those disciplines come to a standardized form of thinking, a standardized form of reporting. For example, in documents, we had the 9-point scale. In fingerprints, maybe they may be identified, not identified, inconclusive. So they may have 3. So how can all these disciplines come to one area? That's the area that we're looking at now. And the OSAC has been in existence about 3 years now, I believe. They meet once or twice a year, once a year. It's a big group, about 520 people. And you have, in each group, you have practitioners from federal, state, private labs. You have statisticians, you have academics, and then you have a legal resource group, you have a human factors resource group, and now I think you also have a statisticians resource group that the various working groups can consult, and when they develop standards, it has to go through these groups first before it can be approved by the Forensic Science Standards Board. Then once those are approved, then it has to go through the Academy Standards Board, hopefully for publication.
Okay. And John, what is your area with OSAC?
I'm in the Fire and Explosion Investigation Subcommittee. We have identified standards. We will be making suggestions for changes to NFPA 921, NFPA 1033. But we're not going to develop our own standards. And I think the OSAC people have found out that developing standards is a harder game than they might have thought initially. They thought they could write their own standards. Now they're working through other standards development bodies. We are, our main goal is to do a strategic vision for fire investigation, where we would like that to be in 10 years. We're also hoping to write a template for a quality assurance manual for fire investigation units.
Okay. And I know our audience would also like to hear about your tips for presenting evidence and cross and direct examination.
Yes. First of all, don't try this alone. Most attorneys are going to get 1 or 2 arson cases in their career. There's some people that specialize in fire cases in the insurance industry, but most criminal defense attorneys, when they call me up, they say, "This is my first arson case," or "I had an arson case 10 years ago. This is my second arson case." You really want to consult with an expert. And taking a fire case to trial without an expert has been found to be ineffective per se. And 2 cases I can refer you to. One is a First Circuit case where the lawyer himself went and walked through the fire scene. The court said that's not enough. In the second case, the Ritchie versus Bradshaw, this was a death penalty case out of Ohio, where counsel hired an expert, but he was determined to not be a competent expert. And it's a very interesting read, and they say that having a competent expert in a fire case is part of effective assistance of counsel. So now when I get these cases, a lot of times people are calling me to do their due diligence. When I review a case for a defense lawyer, I reach the conclusion that the public sector investigator reached the right conclusion 3 out of 4 times. It's a lawyer's worst nightmare if they call me up and I say, "You know what, this is an accidental fire and you have an innocent client. So just getting him a fair trial is no longer enough." So 3 out of 4 times, that means I won't be appearing as a witness or writing a report, but I may very well help counsel avoid being ineffective. And that's what I see as an expert's role in the criminal justice system, is to help counsel avoid being ineffective. At least. There are many cases when I look at it, I say, your guy is good for it. They did it. But I can help you avoid being ineffective in defending him. I know you have to defend him. I don't. So as far as litigation strategies, it's often easier to challenge the qualifications than it is to challenge the methodology. So I would say go there first. Either through a deposition. There's 4 states that allow depositions in criminal trials. That's really, I think, a wonderful way to go, where criminal trials run like civil trials. But most of the states, 46 states, have decided not to do that. So sometimes your first shot comes at trial, and I would challenge the qualifications before the investigator gets to opine. When a prosecutor says, "Judge, I want you to tell the jury this guy's an expert," they ask you have any questions. Ask those questions. Do not stipulate that the guy is an expert unless your expert consultant tells you that. Don't do that on your own, because just because a guy has testified 100 times doesn't mean he's been testifying correctly or using reliable methodology. So and on a cross-examination, I would say present NFPA 921 and get the expert to either accept it or reject it. You can use fire and arson scene evidence, that picture with the fire, that pamphlet with the firefighter on the cover, and that says, look, the Justice Department says you ought to use 921. And there are other authorities that say 921 is authoritative, you should use it. So to the extent that they've deviated, that's where you want to focus on, focus your cross-examination. Now, it's really, there's so many things involved that it's really too complicated to cover all of the cross-examination strategies that you might want. I have got all the resources you could possibly need depending on your case. Send me an email and I'll send you a link to those resources, and you don't even have to retain me to do that.
Great, thank you. We do have a question. It's a very, I think it's a very, very good question. And it's for both of you. So we'll start with Linton, and that is, how do you reduce contextual bias in an examination?
That's an excellent question, and it's one of the really hot topics in forensic science right now. For the last 2 years, I've been part of an expert working group in human factors in handwriting examination, sponsored through NIST. And we had document examiners, human factors experts, statisticians, and academics and psychologists involved in this. And that report should be coming out probably end of this year or very early next year. But a lot of this report dealt with or deals with bias, and how do we deal with bias. The question is, how do you reduce contextual bias in an examination? As a private examiner, I would say it starts with the attorney who calls me. Don't tell me anything. When you call me, give me the case caption. I will do a conflict check. If I have no conflict, then I need to know what's questioned, what is known. Do you have originals? Do you have adequate specimens? What is your time frame in terms of trial coming up or hearing coming up? How soon do you need a report? I don't need to know that this guy was arrested 20 times for forgery before, or he's a convicted murderer, or he's serving time. That is bias. And one of the hardest parts of my job as a private examiner is telling an attorney on the phone, don't say anything. I do not want to know anything. And the less you tell me is better, because whatever you tell me, I take notes. If I'm asked in court, I'll say, this is what I was told. And did it bias you? Maybe or maybe not. But the jury or the judge may say, well, that must have biased this examiner more than he thinks. And we all have biases. So I would say to the attorneys and investigators, when you speak to your expert, give them as little information as possible. They may contact you, or they should contact you afterwards for more specific questions about things that they see that they may want to see. With this circumstance, that may explain this particular observation, but let them ask those questions. So be very careful in your conversations with your experts. For the examiner as well, the examiner has to try to reduce that bias as much as possible. You don't want any background information on the case. If you get too much information, sometimes you just simply refer it to another examiner. For example, at the San Diego Sheriff's Crime Lab, where I worked previously, if I met the detective and he told me about the case, I would make sure that my colleague got the case without any of the information that I had. Now later on, I would have to review this case, so that may have been put some bias into it. So things like that have to be looked at, and hopefully procedures changed to rectify those sorts of instances. But bias is very, very, very important, and the attorney should know and should ask the expert, what were you told about this case, or what do you know about the background of this case?
Great. And John?
The first thing to do is to recognize that bias exists and try to do what you can to avoid it. But with fires, it's a little difficult. If I go up to a fire scene and I cannot unsee the for sale sign in the front yard. It's there. People come up and tell me things that they shouldn't tell me, and I try to ignore that. The safest thing to do is to use two investigators, one to look at the physical evidence and one to run the investigation. In fires, unfortunately, we frequently have the principal investigator, the guy who's supposed to be doing the science, is also the lead prosecution witness, and he does the investigation. So he's not only trying to figure out what happened, but who done it. And I think it's important, if we can manage it, to have a case manager and an analyst doing separate roles. And some of the best investigations that I've reviewed have been done exactly that way.
And you have some unique qualifications. And I know that you're certified in 2 areas. So could you tell us about those areas, and how many experts also share those dual qualifications in both areas?
I think there are 3 fire investigators on the planet that know how to run the laboratory analysis as well, and I'm one of them. So I have a unique perspective for a fire investigator in that I didn't start out as a fireman. I started out as a chemist in the laboratory, and that's how I met fire investigators. They would bring me samples, and I would run them in the laboratory and tell them whether they had something or didn't. I frequently told them they didn't when they might have, because when I first started in this business a lot of years ago, we had very insensitive methods to detect accelerants in samples. These days we have very sensitive methods to the point where I can now detect the mineral spirits that was the thinner for the polyurethane coating that was put on a floor 25 years ago. So it used to be that we could find a drop. If there was a drop of gasoline in a sample, we could find it. These days it's about a 500th of a drop that we can find. But I branched out from the laboratory into the field, and I learned a lot of things that I didn't believe. I was told about shiny alligators and low burning and crazed glass and melted steel and high temperatures. It was commonly thought that accelerated fires burned at a higher temperature than unaccelerated fires. It's not true. They burn at the same temperature. So, and I've done experiments to prove that. I mean, I had the scientific chops to actually run some experiments showing that a room full of newspaper will actually burn hotter than a room where they pour gasoline.
What was, from your perspective, one of the most memorable cases for you?
The most memorable one is a case where I was retained by the prosecution in Jacksonville, Florida, to help convict this guy who supposedly lit a fire that killed his wife's sister, and his sister's 4 children. So there were 6 fatalities. The one survivor was this guy and his wife's 4-year-old son. And the chemist initially found gasoline in the sample, and I was asked to review that, and it turns out there wasn't any gasoline in the sample. And I told the prosecutor that, and they said, well, we got to do something else. And I looked at the fire investigator's work, and I said, well, it looks like an arson. There's low burning through the doorway. There's charring on the floor. And I don't think that flashover could be responsible for this. This was back before we learned much about flashover. And what we did was we actually found another house that had an identical floor plan, and we furnished it exactly like the house where the people died. And we walked people through there, and they said, yeah, it looks just like it. And then we lit it on fire. And this was a part of the test. And that fire burned. The couch was just like gasoline. And within 3.5 minutes, the room was untenable. And within 4 minutes, flashover had occurred. And my colleague and I, who had been working with the prosecutor, had estimated 15, 20 minutes minimum before that room flashes over. And after that test fire, I had to say to the prosecutor, I thought, I can't give the testimony that I had planned to give. And I was set up for a deposition. Florida is one of the states with depositions in criminal cases. I was thoroughly chastened by that experience, and began to try to be a little more conservative in my approach to fires.
And Linton, I'll ask you the same thing. What has been the most memorable question document case for you?
I'll give you one I had testified 2 years ago in LA. The attorney who retained me produced a will, and he said he thinks the signature on the will is forged. And I looked at the signature, and I had lots of specimens, and I told him, actually, that signature is a genuine signature. And he was shocked. I said, the only problem is it wasn't written in 2012. Because I had, the gentleman was very ill, and I had lots of signatures each month for about 2 years before he died. And you can see how his signature was deteriorating. I could actually, based on its quality, say this actually was written maybe in 2010 rather than 2012. So that was one part of the case. And the attorney was just still very shocked that it was a genuine signature. But the party who produced the will, or produced the explanation for the will, also produced a 4-page printed will, which is unsigned. The will, the contents were the exact, almost the same thing as the signed will from 2008, which no one disputed, except for 3 lines that gave the guy's estate to the gardener. There were no erasures on this document, nothing. So my testimony was, okay, it's either this was printed from scratch, new document, or the gentleman had a PDF copy of the will, went into Adobe Acrobat, say edit text and images, save and print, and you cannot tell.
That is.
Yeah, so I give the judge the options. So these are the options. I'm not sure. I can't tell which one is more likely. It's quite an interesting case. I think my side prevailed, so which was good.
All right.
And when I say my side, the side retained me. Not my side.
Yeah, great. And I think that we're up against the clock for this seminar, and I just want to thank you for joining us for today's webinar, and please continue to check the Spotlight section of our homepage on ncstl.org for information about upcoming seminars and webinars. All webinars are available on demand and can be found on the education and training page of our website. And those, the materials that accompany those webinars are also up there for you, the PowerPoint presentations along with the speaker biographies and such. So please make sure to fill out your survey in your email, and this survey will be emailed out to you, and it will enable you to receive your CLE information. So on behalf of Stetson University College of Law, the National Clearinghouse, and the Bureau of Justice Assistance, my guest speakers and myself, and on behalf of the director, Carol Henderson, thank you for attending.